morning. Welcome to our monthly Mornings with O'Keeffe program. My name is Molly, and I manage the adult programs at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, and we are very delighted that you could be here with us this morning. I'd like to begin by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people on which the sites of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude in acknowledgement of the need to confront the ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. I'd also like to take a moment to extend a thank you to our members and donors who are here today, because without you, we wouldn't be able to offer free programs like Morning with O'Keeffe. So thank you very much for your support. If you are not yet a member and you're interested in learning more about what kind of benefits a membership would give you, please consider joining and learn more about how to do that by visiting our website at gokm.org/membership. Throughout the talk, please place your questions in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device. We'll try to answer as many as we can toward the end of the conversation. For the duration of the lecture, the chat box has been disabled. Please do note, however, that following today's talk, a recording of the event will be available on the O'Keeffe Museum's website in a couple weeks once we've added closed captions in Spanish and English. But now, without any further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter this morning, Linda M. Grasso, who is the author of Equal Under the Sky, Georgia O'Keeffe and 20th Century Feminism, published by University of New Mexico Press. It is the first historical study of the artist's complex involvement with and influence on U.S. feminism from 1910 to 1970s. Her most recent article about O'Keeffe is included in 150 Stories, an anthology published by the Art Students League of New York to commemorate their 150th anniversary. Linda is a professor of English at York College and of liberal studies, biography, and memoir of Women and Gender Studies at the Graduate Center at the City of University of New York. Whew, it's quite a mouthful for so many topics. And she holds a PhD and MA in American Studies from Brown University. And today we are so delighted to be talking about a very early time in O'Keeffe's life. We're so used to seeing her photos of her, these iconic photos from when she had come to New Mexico later in life. And so we're really excited to hear from you, Linda, about her early years at the Art Students League. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Molly, so much, and to the museum for inviting me today to share this research that I've done, which I've really enjoyed. So before I begin, I do want to thank Stephanie Cassidy, who's the archivist at the Art Students League of New York, who really is responsible for getting me pulled into the work that I'm going to share with you today. So Stephanie had invited me to contribute to a book that she was envisioning and that she was editing to celebrate the League's 150th anniversary as a premier art school that from its inception in 1875 was a totally student-centered institution. And the book is called 150 Stories. It just came out, and it contains 150 essays written by scholars and artists about the role that the League has played in the lives and work of so many famous students. And, as I just said, I became so intrigued with the research that I did for the short article that's in this book that I wanted to know more, and that's why I'm focusing on this very early period in O'Keeffe's life. And I just want to say, too, before I begin, that I am deeply indebted to the meticulous, groundbreaking research of scholars such as Barbara Beulah Lines, Wanda Corn, and Lori Lyle, among many others who make my work possible. And finally, I want to express my deepest gratitude to the many archivists, librarians, and artist families who aid my sleuthing and understanding. Research is a collaborative process, so I'm really, really grateful to be part of this community. So thank you for coming today, and I'm going to now start. So, in an unpublished autobiographical fragment, which is now archived at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, which O'Keeffe wrote in her later years and was most likely an initial draft for the narrative she included in her 1976 book. O'Keeffe recalls why she became a student at the Art Students League. In 1907, she says, after recovering from a long fever illness, she had had typhoid. She came to New York to attend the League because her brother, who was studying architecture in the city at the time, recommended that she do so. And here is a drawing that O'Keeffe made of her brother Francis, who was the firstborn child and 2 years older than O'Keeffe. Now, in 1907, O'Keeffe was about to turn 20 years old. Perhaps her brother was familiar with the League because of its proximity to his daily activities. At the time, the League was sharing space and resources with the Architectural League, among other art societies, at 215 West 57th Street, the building the League had moved to 15 years earlier in 1892 and still occupies today. Before that time, it had been in several different locations in the city. When O'Keeffe began taking classes in October 1907, 200 students were enrolled, the largest class on record. Now, regardless of why O'Keeffe's brother suggested she come to New York to study art, his plan did not include his sister living with him or any other relatives or friends. Unlike when O'Keeffe was a student at the Art Institute of Chicago 2 years earlier and had lived with her maternal aunt and uncle in New York, she would be on her own. Why? Well, maybe because there was a place she could live cheaply and respectably without relying on her older brother or financially burdening her parents. Her high school mentor, O'Keeffe recalled, quote, recommended that I could stay at the Eva Home for Girls for very little money. The place to stay cost very little. And I just want you to see what these fragments look like. At the time O'Keeffe was working on these, she was losing her sight. So, various transcriptions of O'Keeffe's autobiographical fragment reveal that someone, most probably the assistants who worked with her on biographical projects late in her life, changed her original emphasis on cost from two sentences to one. This certainly improves the prose, but it downplays how much finances mattered to O'Keeffe and her family and determined her choices. Indeed, O'Keeffe's emphasis on cost not only signals the precarity of her financial situation in her student years, it also reminds us that there was a national financial panic in 1907, and it also compels us to consider the difference between an art student's class status and the actual material conditions that shape their daily realities. In other words, we call people middle class, but what does that really mean as they live their lives? Even more significant, O'Keeffe's emphasis on money prompts us to ask how many other women were affected by financial concerns when they chose to study art at the League, as well as the growing number of other art schools in the first decades of the 20th century in New York City. A long, detailed newspaper article published in 1908, which appeared in the women's section of the New York Sun, suggests that O'Keeffe's concerns were common. Headline Caring for the Art Student, the article numbers the newcomers studying art to be between 1,000 and 5,000, with, quote, nearly half the total being women, only a very small percentage of whom can afford to spend more than a very modest sum for living expenses. The article bemoans the lack of decent, affordable living conditions, which were contributing to enfeebled health, poor digestion, and mediocre work of the, quote, large and constantly increasing number of women in the art circles of this city. And even though, quote, at the Art Students League, strangers can obtain a list of addresses of boarding and lodging houses in the vicinity which have been investigated and found suitable for young women, these establishments were proving to be too expensive. In response, the article highlights how, quote, a more or less systemized effort to provide better quarters at low rates for young women art students were currently underway. In addition to arts clubs, young women could find accommodations through the Young Women's Christian Association, which maintained a list of respectable establishments. Now, the Eva, the boarding house in which Georgia O'Keeffe stayed, was one of those establishments. Located at 153 East 62nd Street between Lexington and 3rd Avenues, the Ladies Christian Union opened the house in 1893 and ran it until 1922. The Eva was among 8 houses that the Ladies Christian Union, a philanthropic women's organization, first established in 1858 and dedicated to providing safe, affordable housing for single Christian self-supporting women, ran and operated in an attempt to meet an urgent need. And although the Eva was not specifically intended to house art workers, O'Keeffe reports that when she was a resident, 2 other artists were staying on her floor. Quote, one a commercial artist, the other a painter. And since art students were, quote, on their way to becoming self-supporting, they were admitted as well. Now, the Eva promised respectability, Christian decorum, and, quote, a real home in this vast city. Potential residents needed to apply for admission, provide a testimonial of character, be Protestant, and commit to following regulations. Replicating a middle-class home, the Eva and the other Ladies Christian Union boarding houses contained dining rooms and parlors and were staffed with a house mother who supervised the house's inhabitants who made up home families. The Eva had 35 rooms and in 1915 cost $4.50 to $6 a week. The higher rate included 3 meals a day. And the reason why I know this is because there was a study done in 1915 by a group affiliated with the Young Women's Christian Association that studied living conditions for working women. And here is the title page of that study. Now, an added bonus was that the Eva was walking distance from the League. In her autobiographical fragment, O'Keeffe remembers that she, quote, walked to the lower end of Central Park, past the plaza, till I turned to go to the school building. As one of the women art students quoted in the Caring for the Art newspaper article noted, Staying in a boarding house had three distinct advantages: better food, companionship, and freedom from household cares. In O'Keeffe's autobiographical fragment, she recalls, quote, "The pattern of one's life worked out smoothly. All were at an early breakfast. There was a table with things that you could choose from for your lunch at noon in a sack." But staying at these boarding houses also meant accepting gendered norms of respectability, which undermined women's independence and mobility. The regulations required room inspections to ensure that inmates, which was the term that they used, were abiding by restrictions of what could be kept in them, if, when, and where boarders could entertain visitors, and meeting curfews. Such restrictions were the chief reason some women avoided staying in these houses and chose less hospitable arrangements. Indeed, after the YWCA interviewed 842 women for their 1915 study, the investigators noted, quote, "It was not a particular rule that girls complained of so much as the general atmosphere of being hedged in." The study is really quite illuminating because it includes many of the voices of the actual women that they interviewed. So it's a wonderful historical source. Now, at the same time, however, women's boarding houses like the Eva created opportunities for personal and professional growth and creative enrichment, especially for art students. As one boarder is quoted as saying in a newspaper article about the Ladies Christian Union facilities, quote, "The art students speak of themselves as we artists and usually form a clique of their own." A series of remarkable letters written by Hilda Belcher, one of the artists O'Keeffe identified as a painter who was boarding at the Eva at the same time she was, gives us a rich sense of the kinds of sociability these boarding houses fostered for young women artists. Now, Belcher was a 1904 graduate of the New York Art School, which was begun by William Merritt Chase and is now Parsons School of Design at the New School. And I just want to show you the painting that won her this very prestigious prize. Now, Belcher, who is 6 years older than O'Keeffe and who went on to become an instructor at the Art Students League, was already launched in her career, working as a watercolorist and illustrator for magazines such as Woman's Home Companion and St. Nicholas Illustrated Magazine for boys and girls. So it gives you a real sense of the kinds of work that women artists could get at the time. Writing to her mother, Martha Wood Belcher, who was also an artist, so this is quite fascinating. Belcher mentions O'Keeffe fleetingly in a couple of letters. O'Keeffe is, quote, "a most fascinating girl there, here, and at the house." A month later, she mentions that she, Miss O'Keeffe, and another friend went down to Grace Church and listened to the most beautiful music I have heard. And I just wanted to show you an image of Grace Church, and also to note here that right next to Grace Church is Wanamaker's department store, which Belcher also mentions in her letters. And this just gives us a wonderful indication of the ways in which the church and commerce were so intimately connected in this particular historical moment. Belcher's letters suggest that the EVA provided opportunities to form female friendships, and its regulations did not impede women's mobility about the city. The EVA's location made it easy, not necessarily fast, but easy, to get from one place to another. The closest elevated train station was at 59th Street and 3rd Avenue, and it was a crosstown transportation hub. Belcher's chatty and detail-filled letters offer copious evidence that Belcher and her friends were moving freely across town, downtown, and uptown by foot, train, or streetcar. And here's just one example. I kited all over yesterday, Belcher writes. Went down to Mr. Hawkinson, then on downtown to order a frame for my exhibition picture. Looked at hats and things in general at Wanamaker's. Then came home and in half an hour walked to the museum with Stephen. Stephen was her brother. Up at the museum, we ran into Emily Underwood and Miss McNell and all walked down together. Stephen left us, and the other two came home with me, waited while I scuttled around and packed up some art materials for the evening's sketching. Then we all chased uptown. She then talks about going to Elizabeth Hepburn's for, quote, an evening of sketching nude studies with a male friend as the model. It's worth noting, however, that in one letter, Belcher does fret that a change in the Eva's house supervisor to a more autocratic person, her words, might, quote, prove inconvenient or unendurable. Room inspections and dictates of what we shall keep in them or keep out of them in the way of eatables, lack of freedom to come in late in the evenings, and, quote, inquiries into our religious propensities might force her and her friends to find some other place despite their limited incomes. And I just want to show you here um, one of the paintings she made of one of those friends. This is the painter Tony Nell, who most probably is the other painter that O'Keeffe mentioned, who was also living at the Eva at the same time that she and Belcher were. Now, Belcher's letters about life at the Eva also suggest that women artists use their rooms as studios and fellow boarders as models, thereby enabling each other's creativity and confidence. In one letter, for example, Belcher explains how O'Keeffe posed for her in her room as she completed a painting that garnered a lot of praise and resulted in her membership in the New York Watercolor Club. Georgia O'Keeffe stood by me nobly, she writes, quote, posing after school until it was too dark to see the brushes, and then getting up at 6 the next morning for a session before breakfast. Now, Belcher's request was so flattering to O'Keeffe, she recalled the experience in her autobiographical fragment. After a few days, O'Keeffe writes, the painter, Hilda Belcher, said to me, I have been making a portrait of a woman in a black and white checkered dress, but I haven't been able to put hands and face on her. Could you pose for me and let me put your face and hands on my painting? No one had ever asked me to do anything like that, so I was rather pleased and of course said yes, and saw my face and hands added to the painting. And this is the painting. Now, this anecdote, it bears mentioning, is strikingly different from the one O'Keeffe tells about Eugene Spiker's imperious insistence that she model for him when they were both students at the League, which O'Keeffe talks about in both the unpublished fragment and her book. Spiker, she writes, was one of the older students at the League and a very handsome young man who often stopped me because he wanted me to pose for him. But I wanted to work myself. He was so persistent, she continues, that one day he literally would not let her pass, blocking the whole stairway. When she continued to resist, he retorts, "It doesn't matter what you do. I'm going to be a great painter, and you will probably end up teaching painting in some girls' school." Now, in my research, I discovered that Spiker had a lot of power at the league. He was an elected member of the league's board of control, their self-governing management group, which still exists today. And he was also a class monitor for William Merritt Chase's portrait painting class. And I have two friends who are right now taking classes at the league. And when I told them about this, they said, "Oh, the class monitor is very important." So, so here we see O'Keeffe's anecdote about Spiker underscoring her self-portrayal as an artist who overcomes challenges, is fueled by ambition, and who refuses to allow men to block her advancement. And what I find particularly interesting here is that O'Keeffe told the Spiker story, but not the Hilda Belcher story in her book. Perhaps because the Belcher story connected her to women's worlds, and by the end of her career, she was determined to present herself as a genderless, archetypal American artist who overcame adversity and triumphed over male peers and antagonists. Yet, and I find this interesting too. Although O'Keeffe emphasizes her resistance to Spiker, she did agree to pose for him, and the painting earned Spiker a $50 prize for the likeness. 40 years later, in 1948, a Life magazine photographer captured O'Keeffe looking at Spiker's portrait when that portrait was included in an auction to benefit a Bronx hospital. And here is the photograph. Life cropped it a bit, but here is the original photograph. Now, in the photograph, the young O'Keeffe looks unflinchingly at the viewer, her heart-shaped face framed by lush, dark, chin-length hair. Dressed in a black smock, white blouse, and a rakishly angled bow tie, the young O'Keeffe projects alluring confidence, her unsmiling face fearless and purposeful. Twinned through time, the older O'Keeffe stands so close to the portrait that it appears as if their bodies touch. Like that of her younger, painted self, the mature O'Keeffe is unsmiling, intense, and guardedly dignified, arresting in its doubled image of an quote aging dignitary. That's what Life magazine calls her, publicly communing with her fresh-faced, open-eyed former self. The photograph invites us to contemplate what O'Keeffe was experiencing as she looked at herself rendered by Spiker. And let's remember, this is 2 years after Stieglitz had died. So let's imagine O'Keeffe unformed as Spiker's portrait helps us to do in the early process of becoming. Although O'Keeffe reports in her book that she did not like school, she had had many academic experiences studying and practicing art making before enrolling at the League, beginning with private lessons from a local watercolorist, Sarah Mann, in her childhood town of Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, and continuing in high school art classes. She then advanced to a year of study at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, living with family and taking classes in drawing, painting, lettering, and the history of painting and sculpture. Illness, aptitude, and dwindling family finances may have been why O'Keeffe went to the Art Students League a year later. When she arrived, she was expectant and impressionable, an artist in the making. living independently for the first time in a teeming northeastern metropolis among offering countless frolics, which is a word that she uses, and delights, O'Keeffe participated in an artistic culture and community unlike any other she had previously experienced. Quote, "We all worked hard," League classmate Lila Wheelock Howard recalled, "and then we played hard. We had lots of fun." In private letters, public interviews, and her memoir, O'Keeffe implicitly suggests that it was during her year of painting at the League that she discovered her magnetic sexual power and unquenchable drive. In her joyful descriptions of still life painting instructor William Mellor Chase, she suggests that the League was where she learned that an artist could enact a lively professional identity, an artistry that she went on to perfect. Chase, O'Keeffe recalled, wore a high silk hat, rather tight, fine brown suit, light colored spats and gloves, a carnation in his lapel. There was something fresh and energetic and fierce and exacting about him. His love of style, color, paint as paint, was lively. Now, O'Keeffe went on to infuse her own love of style in modernist aesthetics, dress, decor, friendships, and daily choices, as Wanda Corn has so brilliantly shown us in Living Modern. O'Keeffe's unpublished autobiographical fragment helps us to see a different picture of her artist in the making experiences. Her first year in New York City, when she was a student at the Art Students League, links her to other women, art students, and practitioners who were responding to increased career opportunities in the arts and industrial design, women's changing gender roles, geographic urban expansion, transportation innovations, and a gendered race and ethnically diverse yet segregated city. And I want to show you again another page from that 1915 study so you get some sense of the ways in which people were categorized at the time. And I want to call your attention especially to religion being an important category there. Now, these stratifications were also part of League culture, as evidenced by the League's predominantly male power structure. While from its inception, the League included women in its administration and welcomed them as students, that did not mean that women were perceived as equals by instructors and male peers. When Louise Cox, who attended the League in 1877, recorded her memories in 1945, she recalled that instructor Kenyon Cox, whom she eventually marries in 1892, was alleged to be, her words, a confirmed misogynist. She also recalled male students as being very condescending to their female peers. When O'Keeffe attended the League 3 decades later, these gender inequities remained in place. And I want to show you this satirical drawing that comes out of the League at the time, because even though it's meant as satire, I think that it gives us some sense of the way women art students may have felt in that particular historical moment. Additionally, the 1907-1908 schedule of classes shows us that most of the instructors were men. I know this is hard to see, and I've highlighted the two women who were teaching at the time. They were Alice Beckenworth and Rhonda Holmes Nichols. And importantly, they were teaching miniature and watercolor painting, two areas that were considered women's domains, and they were allowed to teach only on Saturdays. It wasn't until 1937 when Isabel Bishop became an instructor that a woman was hired to teach full time at the League. Now, racial perceptions at the League were also mirrored those in the culture at large. Quote, race is not just a conception, historian Matthew Fry Jacobson reminds us, it's also a perception. And a striking example of this is that O'Keeffe was nicknamed Patsy by her League peers because of her Irish name and ancestry. Quote, everyone calls her Patsy because her name was O'Keeffe, classmate Lila Wheelock Howard recalled. O'Keeffe's peers perceived her Irish heritage as a defining characteristic of her identity. And I want to point out here that Howard's comment makes clear that it was at the Art Students League in 1907, 1908 that her friends started to call her Patsy or Pat, not when she came back to New York to attend Teachers College in 1914, 1915, as a 1915 letter from her friend Anita Politzer might lead us to believe. In the letter, Politzer, whom O'Keeffe had met at Teachers College, suggests that it was their mutual friend Dorothy True who initiated the name. Addressing the letter to Dear Pat, Politzer asked, mayn't I snitch Dorothy's name for you? It's the only thing that fits, and I do love it so. Has she a patent on it, or may I use it? Answer, please. And as an aside, Dorothy True is immortalized in this 1919 photograph taken by Alfred Stieglitz, which depicts her face superimposed on her stocking leg and shoe, symbolically representing the modern emancipated woman. But as far as I've been able to track, True was a Barnard College graduate, looking decidedly less glamorous here, who took classes at the League from 1915 to 1916. She marries and then she moves to California with her mining engineer husband. I don't know yet whether she actually had a professional career in art as the other women that I've mentioned all did, but we will find out. Um, Now, back to what I was talking about a minute ago. It doesn't matter that O'Keeffe's paternal immigrant grandparents were relatively privileged compared to the majority of mid-19th century Irish immigrants who were fleeing poverty, starvation, and British subjugation. O'Keeffe had an Irish name, and Irish stereotypes were pervasive. Among the largest groups of European immigrants to enter the US in the mid-19th century, Irish people were classified by the science of the time as less evolved in white racial hierarchies and parodied in popular culture and the press. And I'm going to show you here just one very extreme example of this kind of thinking and this kind of logic. Considered unfit for self-government, uneducated, unruly, and unskilled, the Irish were classified as, quote, racially distinct. An Irish woman with artistic aspirations was an anomaly. In 1900, 60.5% of all Irish-born women worked as domestic laborers. And in a predominantly Protestant country, I think we forget this, the Irish were reviled for their Catholic beliefs. And although by the time O'Keeffe was in New York, the Irish had successfully established themselves in local politics, the church, and civil service, perceptions of the Irish as other still persisted. And I'm going to again turn to that study of living conditions of self-supporting women to give you just one example of this. Um, quote, all types, they're talking about landladies right here. All types, all nationalities, and all degrees of culture were encountered in this study of 500 furnished room houses, they report. The slovenly Irish kimono bedecked type predominating. Now, I found this fascinating. These social structures even existed in O'Keeffe's family. Biographer Roxana Robinson notes that O'Keeffe's parents were buried separately because her mother's maternal aunts, quote, would not permit a Catholic to share the Protestant Toto ground in Madison, where Ida O'Keeffe, O'Keeffe's mother, was buried. So her father was buried in the O'Keeffe plot in some prairie. Her mother was Protestant, her father was Catholic. And really fascinating in all of this is that within this larger context, O'Keeffe took advantage of being stereotyped as Irish to christen herself with a new identity. When her League friends nicknamed her Patsy, sometimes shortening it to Pat, O'Keeffe adopted the name and used it in her correspondence. "Thank you for calling me Pat," she replies to Politzer. "I like it. It always seemed funny that we called one another Miss." So even though O'Keeffe's League peers in effect ethnicized her, it was an identity O'Keeffe embraced in her formative years. In one revealing letter O'Keeffe wrote to her close friend Florence Cooney in 1910, for example, she signs her name Pat and then remarks, "It seems so funny to say Pat anymore. Here I'm Georgia, Miss O'Keeffe, and often Mrs. O'Keeffe, and I feel centuries older than Pat. I'll be 23 next month. Think of it." And in a postscript written on the side of this letter, she says, "Tell me, Floss, what happened to that picture that Spiker painted of me?" And here we can see that as early as 1910, the Spiker portrait was connected to O'Keeffe's memories of herself as a young artist on the cusp of maturity at the Art Students League. But as O'Keeffe's correspondence attests, her maturation was a process. She continued to hold on to the Irish nickname. She signed her name Pat in some of the letters she wrote to Palliser between 1915 and 1916. I've been thinking about this, why? Well, maybe perhaps because imagining herself as Pat offered her what she needed as she was psychically separating herself from her family, attempting to create a career path, and trying to figure out how to become economically independent. It also may have made her feel special. A decade later, though, when she becomes a well-known exhibiting professional artist, she sheds the identity entirely. To my knowledge, claiming Irish ancestry was never part of O'Keeffe's carefully crafted artistic persona. Now, O'Keeffe mythologized her How I Became an Artist origin story, but historical evidence enables us to see a more complicated trajectory. It is clear that O'Keeffe's year of painting at the Art Students League gave her more options to contemplate. In the fall of 1908, after she completed her studies at the League, and was back living what she called regular girl style with her family in Virginia, she wrote to classmate Florence Cooney that she was ambivalent about returning to the League. She says, "When I think of the fight to live up there, it seems like this is the place for a girl. It doesn't seem like she ought to be bumping around New York alone. I don't know which is worse, to be up there where you like the people around you and you have some end in view, but all the bumps of a hard road, or down here leading this aimless existence in a regular girl style. But yet she confided, 3 or 4 times a day, I get a wild longing for you people and to do exactly as I please. New York and the League represented freedom, challenge, excitement, and purpose. Ultimately, although O'Keeffe lamented the bumps of a hard road, she decided she did want to return to the League and the EVA, and she hoped that Cooney would go back and try it with her. It turned out, however, that there was no family money for O'Keeffe to do so, and so she moved back to Chicago, lived once again with her aunt and uncle, and tried to make a living as a freelance commercial artist. But then illness derailed that plan, and she ended up back in Virginia with her family, hoping to get a job teaching art. One wonders how many other women who attended the League and roomed at boarding houses like the Eva experienced similar setbacks and circuitous career trajectories because of limited material conditions, but nevertheless succeeded in becoming professional artists whose work and stories we're continuing to uncover. Ultimately, I think the significance of the Art Students League in O'Keeffe's 7 decades long career is more about self-discovery than the skills she gained as a professional in training, although she did gain lots of skill there. While at the League, she discovered her talent to attract other artists who helped propel her forward. She established friendships with educated, avant-garde new women her own age who became epistolary companions and confidants. She assumed a new artistic identity that connected her to her familial roots and childhood. She forged ties with accomplished exhibiting male artist teachers who later supplied her with letters of recommendation for teaching positions. She experienced romantic relationships with fellow young male art students, which introduced her to the erotic thrill of sharing artistic passion, and she began to hone what one scholar calls her, quote, vanguard modernist eye. So, in essence, then, while O'Keeffe's year of painting at the League was an educational and cultural training ground that replicated gender, ethnic, and racial hierarchies in turn of the 20th century New York City, it also provided opportunities to advance her skills, win prizes and scholarships, find inspiring models of artistic self-fashioning, test out new identities, and realize that there was, as she says in her book, definitely something she had to say. Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Wow, what a terrific glimpse into what it must have been like for O'Keeffe at that age to begin what she wouldn't have realized at the time to be such a formative time. And I so loved the inclusion all the pictures of the clothing and the interiors and the faces of her colleagues and friends, because you've just painted this incredible picture of what it would have felt like to actually been there at that time. So thank you so much. Okay, let us take a look, reminding folks that you can ask questions at this time. We have about 10 minutes, and I'll go ahead and start. We have a quick question from Dory, who asked if Georgia's sister or did any of Georgia's relatives also attend the Art Students League, or was it just Georgia?
I believe it was just her. The other sisters did attend Chatham Episcopal Institute, which was the high school that she finished in Virginia. But as far as I know, it was just O'Keeffe who attended.
Great. And let's see. And Joan is wondering, on the slide where you showed the restrictions and you had some highlighted areas, could you clarify again what that data was used for? Was that for students at the Art League for classes?
That was, they were using that, those categories to detail the list of places that Christian self-supporting women could live in that were, and so they were using those categories to distinguish the houses in terms of who will accept ca Jews, you saw, right? No colored, who will accept black women, who will accept Catholics. And I think from my understanding so far of the historical moment, that those categories are very salient in terms of thinking about how the city was structured at the time.
Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. We have another question about the Art Students League as it exists today. So you had mentioned at the beginning of your talk about how so much support from the Art Students League contributed to your incredible research of this. And would you be able to talk just a little bit about what the Art Students League looks like today and maybe what your research there consisted of?
Uh, well, to tell, I feel like an honorary member. I don't really know. I have friends who are um, taking classes there, and the first time that I went to meet with Stephanie Cassidy, it was so wonderful because, here it was like I live in New York, I could just go over there, and she gave me a tour. And I must say that as I took this tour, and she introduced me to some of the people in the classes and who were teaching there at the time. It's amazing. There's just this spirit that pervades the place because anybody can go, and there's no degree attached to it, so there's a lot more flexibility to what people can do. They can go, they can stop going, they can go back again. And in fact, when I was working on Equal Under the Sky, I had asked Stephanie for the registration records to see if she had them of O'Keeffe's mentor from high school, Mrs. Willis. And she didn't turn anything up at the time, but since, because they've been digitizing a lot of the records, she did turn up some registration cards, and it looks like it's probably her because she has both her nickname and her married name there, that she had gone back and taken classes like at the turn of the century. So you can get a lot of information from the registration cards. Um, but that, like so many archives now, it's a process. And it's really only Stephanie who's like, does this whole thing. She's incredibly knowledgeable. So I really urge people who are interested in the history of the league or anything to, check out the resources there. It's a wonderful, wonderful repository, and there's so much work to be done, including on women, the history of women who attended. There's a wonderful book that came out quite a while ago where Marion Wardle had edited this book and also did an exhibition where they did it's really amazing. They tracked many of Henry's students, Robert Henry's students. So that book is a treasure of information to start with. But all of you graduate students out there, there are so many projects to be done on this history. I hope that answers the question.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for elaborating and just to hear you describe it, your research, not just here, but with other institutions. It sounds like some real detective work you're doing, but tying these things together and making a complete story. It sounds So fun. I will go ahead and share this question from Dale Cronkrite, who, for those of you who tune in regularly to the Mornings with O'Keefe program, would recognize as the conservator here, an accomplished conservator overall in at the George O'Keefe Museum. But he says, I associate O'Keefe's creative innovations with forms and colors of natural objects like flowers and leaves and shells and things like that. In your research, have you found any evidence that she was looking at natural forms while she was at the Art Students League, among the big city? Do you know if she was doing similar
That's
things?
a really good question. One of the things that I'm kind of committed not to spend 10 years on this. I just want to publish this article, but one of the things I think one of the ways to kind of answer that question within thinking about her in the inside the institution and taking the classes is to mine some of the records of other students that were there at the time and maybe some of the teachers as to what they were using. I can't remember now who it was. Maybe it was Leela Howard, who was talking about the actual classes and that they were asked to do these still lifes of objects and then they would eat them. They would eat the apple and they would be eating the fruit later on. So it's that I know. So there was that kind of thing going on, but that's a great question. And also I don't know what she was doing outside. Um, there's a whole month, for example, where I think it's March 1908, where she wasn't taking classes, and I'm kind of like, well, where is she? Yeah, so the thing is, and Elizabeth Ernst confirmed this for me, there's so little um, documented records from her at this very early period. And it's really fascinating that those Florence Cooney letters from this early moment are exist. Now, is that because Cooney sent them to her later on, sent them to the archive? Is that because O'Keeffe kept them herself? There are no letters that I know of Dorothy True in the archive. So, that raises the whole question of what gets preserved and why. I think in order to do this work, in order to reconstruct women's histories, it's so important to try to figure out how to create the frame to pull from all this other stuff to illuminate. So the Hilda Belcher letters are just remarkable in what they give us from that period. And I'm very happy to say that Hilda Belcher's family is currently working on a history of that family, which is so important
Mm,
too.
fantastic. And that question dovetails just a little bit too into a question from Barbara concerning the painting Rabbit with Copper Pot, which those of you who have read O'Keeffe biographies will have seen this painting from her very early times. And I believe, did she create this painting during her time at the Art Students League too?
Yes, I didn't include that. I had so much stuff. I had to like, what should I leave out? So yes, she made that painting in William Merritt Chase's class and actually won a scholarship based on that painting, which enabled her then to go to the summer school, which is where that picture is from. That's from Lake George. So they had their summer school at Lake George, um, and she had won the money that enabled her to do that. But after she did that, then she was back in Virginia. But what's interesting to me is that she was in terms of my trying to put together the names that I mean there are so many names she mentions in these letters, so that's why I have to go sit with Stephanie. Who is this person? Who is that? But she was in the crowd and she herself was a prize winner and she was in the crowd of prize winners. So yeah, she was a star student. And just to correct, and maybe, I've assumed that people will get this, but just to reemphasize, because there was some comment on the Facebook page, this is all pre-Stieglitz. She does not meet Stieglitz and really know him, right, until 1916. She starts corresponding with him. So she does go to 291. She talks about that in the fragment and in the book, but she doesn't really know Stieglitz yet. Politzer is kind of up there and, kind of establishing a relationship with him. So just so people know, this is like, the the pre-Stieglitz time.
Absolutely. Okay, and as usual, all the questions come at the end, unfortunately, so we won't have time to get to them all since we are at 10:01. But I do like to close these talks with just a comment from the audience, and I'll share what Kathleen has to say. She says, "What a fabulous presentation. I want my 25-year-old daughter to hear this and understand the trials and triumphs of women who paved the wave for us all." So thank you, Linda, for sharing
Oh,
the side of Patsy. It's been very
oh,
enlightening. And
thank you. So
yes,
that's
other
very
remarks.
nice. I
Thanking you for
just
your
wanted to
time.
say, Molly, that if people want to write to me, they're totally welcome to. I'm easy to find. It's just lgrasso@york.cuny.edu. So thank you to
Fantastic.
everybody for coming and for your interest.
Yes, thank you so much. And we do send a follow-up email, so I can include your email in that and encourage
Okay.
folks who are maybe doing their own research to reach out if they have additional questions. But in the meantime, just seeing lots of thank yous and appreciation for your time, which I will echo. Thank you so much for being with us today and for your previous participation in programs like this.
Well,
We
thank you.
really are grateful.
Well, I'm grateful too to be part of this wonderful series. So.
Thank you. We're glad you could be. And before we sign off, is there anything you'd like to share before we end the call?
No, just that I guess to reiterate what I said in the beginning, that research is a collaborative process, and I really am indebted to all the scholars who built the knowledge base that I'm working on and the family members who so graciously are sharing materials and all the archivists who answer their phones and, send me materials and talk to me. So, yes, to feminism and to research.
Fantastic. A great thing to end on. So thank
Okay.
you again. And we'll see you all next time and a great rest of the day to everyone. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye-bye.